It's the 5 minute major, in this case, probably the 10-minute misconduct, brought to you by Hockey Wanderlust. Rob Simpson with you here, and my cohort and distinguished partner, Ken Yaffe, along.
Hello, Simmer. Great to be here.
Yes, Ken Yaffe will be basically conducting an interview for the most part with his dear friend and former NHL cohort, Bryant McBride, who is a serial entrepreneur and the producer of the unbelievably wonderful documentary about Willie O Ree called Willie. Hey, Bryant.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, guys.
And of course, a huge advocate for diversity in general terms, and of course in sports, and particularly in the sport of hockey. So let's start right there, Bryant, and tell us a little bit about getting this thing going with Willie O Ree.
We were really intent on taking what ice hockey in Harlem, the Detroit Jack Adams program, Mariucci hockey in Minnesota, and Fort DuPont in Washington, D.C. Those were kind of four pillars that were out there that were doing really great things to provide access. And that was the key word to kids, to kids of color, mostly, economically disadvantaged kids who wanted to play the sport and needed to put the pieces together, and saw what they were doing, met with them, did a lot of listening, did a lot of learning, and then came back to Gary and to others and said, we need to do something in this area. And in that process, worked closely with Lou Vero at USA Hockey, and Louis is still a dear friend, and we dove in when I was able to say, hey, USA Hockey is in, let's do this. And that was the impetus to get it going. And Lou, it was Lou actually who said, hey, we should find Willie O Ree. And I was like, oh my God, that's a great idea. And then, pre-Google. So it's in the film, but I called a friend of mine from the FBI, and my buddy said, okay, yeah, he was a hockey fan. And he was like, yeah, give me a little time. Next day, he goes, hey, he's working in security at a hotel in San Diego. And I was like, are you serious? He's like, yeah. And I called him, and Willie was like, he'd been promised a lot for a long time, right? People, because Willie's the greatest guy in the world, most humble, earnest, gracious man you'll ever meet, like unbelievably gracious for what happened to him and what he went through. Just to come out the other side so positive, it's amazing to me still to this day.
Suffice it to say, Bryant, you and Lou Vero, who is a wonderful hockey man and a name that everybody in the sport should know, without that effort, Willie might have been lost on the history of the game.
He may have been. I mean, it's probably likely that he would have been. He had been invited to a few events over the years, but he was forgotten. He was people had kind of moved on, and he was living in San Diego, so he wasn't in Toronto or Montreal or New York or Chicago, and kind of in the path of a lot of the activity that goes on in the hockey world. He was off the beaten track. But I just felt it was really important that he was the equivalent of our Jackie Robinson, right? Yeah. And to not acknowledge that, to not have him be that. I was Kenny and I were suits, right? And we were running around in a suit every day, and to show up at in a locker room in Detroit and talk the talk, we could do it, and we did do it. But to have the first Black player show up and say, hey, this is what I went through, you can do this too, the sport is for you. It was really impactful. And I got to underline it. There is nobody in the world who's better at his job than Willie O Ree. And he's still doing it. He's still going strong. He's an amazing guy.
And Brian, part of this is, the one thing that I think is a consistent view of you as a professional is that your tenacity is unmatched. And Brian's tenacity has brought this story out, but then I think it's also brought issues to the surface in the game. Of course, there's broader issues of social injustice, racial inequality. Sport is a great platform to elevate these issues, and I want to get into some of that if we can.
Sure, of course. It's a really interesting time right now, right? It's been these last few years have just been really eye-opening for so many people. But you go back to the history and you look at sports' role in racial justice issues. I mean, it goes really far back, right? Because I think even before we go to sports, I think it's really important, okay, There's 5 books that I recommend, and I'll send these to you, Kenny. I promised you I would. I haven't yet, but I will, that I recommend to people because I think it's critically important. And shamefully, I've only read these books in the last 4 years, right? I'm in my mid-50s. I've been lucky enough to go to good schools. I consider myself, a student of a lot of things, but I didn't do this deep dive. And these books are The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, Brian Stevenson's Just Mercy, and Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law. They provide a 360 perspective of the Black experience over the last 400 years. And the takeaway after all that reading, and it's a heavy lift, it's hard reading. I would even throw in, Frederick Douglass's first autobiography as well. So it really takes you deep into what happened and why it happened in an irrefutable way, right? And without politicizing any of this, there's lots of pushback on critical race theory and whatnot, but these books are irrefutable. This is just what happened. And the takeaway from that, frankly, and it's hard, is the insidious intent with which this was done. This is evil like I've never seen, I've never read. I couldn't believe some of the things I was reading, frankly. And I think everyone needs to understand that in their belly, in their soul, to really understand, because it helps explain how we got here. If you don't know where you came from, it's hard to know where you're going.
Let's take that to hockey now. Okay,
Yeah.
So you've spent a better part of 30 years now advocating for diversity in the game. So here's a tough question. 30 some odd years later, are we in a better place in the game? Maybe there were a handful
yes and
Black
no
players in the NHL in the early 90s, and fast forward some 30 years later, we're at about 40 some odd players in the league. How are we doing?
Yeah, how we're doing is, this is how we're doing. The reason that Willie came back, or that I was eager to have Willie come back, because he was authentic, right? He represented authenticity. And in doing this work, in doing DEI work, and doing social justice work, authenticity is everything, because people can smell BS a mile away. They can smell performative garbage a mile away. And Willie is just so authentic in what he does. And I try to do the same and be authentic as I can. So from a metric of, faces of color, BIPOC individuals on the ice, we're doing better. We're at 10x, right? Than when we started. There were 3 or 4 players. Now there's, as you said, 30 to 40. So yes, box check. Yes, that's improving. That said, that took 30 years. That's too long. That's way too long. And the reason I mentioned authenticity, there's only one league right now in North America that has any authenticity, real authenticity on this issue, and it's the NBA. They walk the walk, they talk the talk, they back up what they say. Baseball struggles with it, football really struggles with it. They all do, right? And hockey really struggles with it. So that we were doing some things, but superficially, not in a way that it needs to be done, where it's in the heart of the game. It's part of who we are. It's the parts of the game that are so important: one-on-one battles, perseverance, resilience, getting back up, being a great teammate, right? Those are all amazing traits in the game that we have to share with all people. And we're not doing that in a really effective way still. In an authentic way, we're still not doing that, because the culture of the game isn't there yet. There's a lot of kids, a lot of people that are marginalized in the game who love the game but hate the locker room. Hockey is I argue, and I put forth to my friends of color all the time, it is the most important sport for kids of color to play, bar none. And they're like, what are you talking about? You're not welcome there. And I walk them through it. Nobody's born with skates on. Hockey's the great equalizer. You get out there, and the first thing that happens is you fall on your butt, and you learn to get back up again and again and again and again. And it's a muscle. That's a muscle that can be attributed to STEM. It can be attributed to, climbing the corporate ladder. I mean, whatever it is a muscle of achievement and figuring it out no matter what, being a great teammate, all those other things, so that when you show up in October and you finish in April of that first, second, or third year, and it doesn't matter if you're 16 or 26 or 36, that mastery, that ascent over those months. I just did something really hard with a group of people that just supported me and I supported them. We're all in this. That is a gift. And as a kid of color, you're going to need that.
What's next? What programs, what messaging do we need? It's not just the NHL's responsibility, but the hockey community broadly, defined North America and Europe. What more needs to be done to diversify the game and make it more accessible?
It's the reason that I made the film. You know, I'm not a traditional filmmaker. I just felt I made this film. It's more about social justice and hockey than it is about being a filmmaker, right? I needed scale. We needed scale. Scale is the key. We've handed out, you built, Kenny, you built great programs all across North America, across the world, putting sticks in kids' hands, regardless of what was on their feet, right? And that has worked. And that's part of the reason for the growth of the diversification of the game. That said, a lot of the world right now is about screens. And we needed to have a normalized, aspirational view of a BIPOC person achieving on every screen that we could put eyeballs on. So hence, when we made the film, it traveled, right? And Willie doesn't have to be everywhere. I don't have to be everywhere. Others don't have to be everywhere. Kim Davis doesn't have to be everywhere. We wanted this to live and scale, like only media can. So what's next is more of that. We want to do, it needs a deep understanding of history by the players and a concerted community effort where we're speaking with one voice, where there's no exclusion. Helping kids is not exclusionary, right? Or it's not an exclusive, better said, right? So that the players of color in a scrum are saying something. Eustace King, the agent, is saying something. The efforts that we've got going with Willie are saying something. Educators that we've made the film available to from a social emotional learning standpoint are saying something. But all of it normalizing and then following up Willie with more stories told, by the way, not from observers of the game about, hey, this is what's happening to the LGBTQT community in hockey, or the indigenous population, or the BIPOC, population, but told from the inside out. Here's our story. Here's what's happening. Here's what's happening to me. Those kids from Syria who came to Canada at 12, 13, and in a non-traditional way, Hockey Canada didn't really have anything for them. How do you start playing hockey when you're 12 or 13? It's just not built for that, right? So figuring out how they can fit in and find an on-ramp into the game, be welcomed, help them grow, help them assimilate into the country, make them feel part of something bigger than themselves. It is that cadence and that rhythm that is needed over the next 10 years, because there's the opportunity to change that 30-year 10X to a 10-year 7, 8, 9, 10X, so that 2/3 or so that 200, 300 players are players of color, and we're drawing from the greatest athletes in the world who are on that surface representing their teams.
Well, your conviction on the issues and tenacity pours out of you in the discussion, and I'm super proud of you, Bryant, for the work that you've done. And we really appreciate having you and look forward to having you back to continue.
Brian, outstanding job on the film and a great job today. We appreciate it. It was fun to watch you and Ken reconnect as well.
Thank you guys for having me. You're doing Wanderlüst is a must read. I read it every week, and I encourage everybody else to do it as well. And again, thank you guys for having me. It's great.